This is Just a Few Questions from Chicago. I'm your host, Marc Sims, and I have Brian Mullins on the line. He's an activist, and he loves to talk about education. Brian, we were talking off air about this
Sure.
antiquated, and in part one of our podcast, about this antiquated education most students receive in America.
Right.
When do you think the teachers unions, the unions of America, and the administrations of all these towns and cities are going to transform education for the modern era, not this old antiquated education most students get?
Right. I think, Mark, I think that is a critical question we should be talking about. That should be the number one priority. We have watched this same system fail kids for decades. They're not prepared for any long-term sustainable jobs. There's no vocational training. There's no heavy coding and AI and things that we know are going to be taught for the future. I'm 50 years old. We learned theorems and periodic tables and facts and figures and dates. And guess what? So I have a 50-year-old son, and I look at what he's learning now.
You mean a
And
30-year-old son?
well, I got a 30-year-old daughter, a 21-year-old son, a 15-year-old son, right?
There you
But the
go.
15-year-old now, he goes to Gwendolyn Brooks. And I sit back, and it's funny because he brings this saying to me, Dad, why do I have to learn this stuff when I can ask my phone? And it makes me sit back like, hey, man, that really makes a lot of sense, right? So I think we need to integrate technology into education, but we got to look at who loses when we do that. I mean, at the core of it, do they really want African Americans to thrive inside of these cities all over the country? I believe they don't, right? So it's a lot of issues and outshoots of that question. And when we talk about education, CPS here in Chicago is a $7.7 billion entity. We got to ask ourselves, what are they doing with $8 billion a year when all we see is failed education, except for the top 10 schools in the whole district and network? We know that is a patronage-laden system. We know that there are contracts going out the door. We know that these systems set up that were failing by originally Mayor Daley, and it's kept in place by Rahm, kept in place by Lori Lightfoot. There is no difference in any of that. And you got to talk about personnel, right? I'm trying to wrap my head around our current CPS CEO, right? When you sit back and you realize that she said she would tell you that she's been mentored by Arnie Duncan, that threw up signs for me at the beginning when they first brought her in. So she's part of the exact same system. She worked as the number two in the Forest Claypool when Arnie Duncan, and all those connections. And if the listeners don't know, it all starts with the Daley family. They're all connected, right? And so I don't believe that Janice Jackson is the one to upturn education, because that means shining a light on billions of dollars in contract, employees down at 39th Street that don't do anything, teachers, principals that are in places, and it starts to challenge all this. When you bring people like the Chicago Teachers Union into conversation, I mean, what is their end goal? They're supposed to be protecting the teachers, but we know under Karen Lewis, CTU went from a service union to a political union. They don't serve the teachers like they used to. So at some point, since there are a lot of inner working parts to these conversations, and I think the first thing the public needs to do is we need to educate ourselves up to these levels. I'm one on the education side. I've sit in these Zooms and been sitting in meetings before. And basically the unspoken word is Black parents don't engage in their schools. They don't show up to get the report cards. They don't do this. They don't do that. One of the pieces of the missing conversation is that CPS and CTU funds organizations to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars a year for parent engagement and parent outreach. So you could talk about the Pilsen Alliances, the Raise Your Hands, the Parents for Teachers. They are paid organizations to go and organize white parents and Hispanic parents. Well, guess what who they don't fund? Black parents. So there's no Black organization being funded that takes upon this task. But then the system turns around and says, what's wrong with you Black parents? Why? And I'm like, hey, why don't you put that $20 million into educating and mobilizing the Black parent? So again, we have many different issues. Going back to your original question, we need to completely revamp these curriculums. Online e-learning should be, we should, as a Black community, we need to embrace that and figure out what can we do and take this moment in time to change up how we educate our own children. How do we change the system? But I have no faith, because I don't believe these people care enough to completely tear apart the system at this time.
Okay, one last question. I'll let you go and finish your day.
Sure.
Brian Mullins, activist here in Chicago.
Yep.
Uh, Schools are supposed to teach students how to learn, teach them
Correct.
how to learn, how to be autodidactic or
Correct.
autodidacts at some point, because you have
Correct.
to constantly learn new skills and new things, and you teach them how to learn. And
Correct.
so I think you shouldn't leave a public schools, any school, without
Mm.
be able to speak well to some degree, write
Correct.
well to some degree, string a damn sentence together,
Correct.
coherently written and spoken, and some
Correct.
interpersonal skills and some self-esteem skills. You got to feel good about
Sure.
yourself. What
Sure.
you just asked the question earlier. When are
Okay.
the parents? I mean, really mean African American parents,
Sure.
ADOS
Sure.
parents, are going to
Sure.
demand a new
Sure.
curriculum for their students?
Right. And I think that's the challenge. And that's what we're trying to work on right now. Um, it's also, I think, disingenuous again to put on the black parents who are mired in school closings from the year 2000. 200 schools have been turned around and closed. Our communities have been ridden with violence and poverty and disinvestment and no investment by the city, mental health conditions. I don't think it's fair to point back to that same group of people and say, when are you all just going to wake up and start engaging like a normal community? You know, you have parents, if you have single parents or families where the parents are working all day and they worried about getting home, taking care of the kids, or the kids getting shot on the street. That doesn't allow for the time to bake some cookies and go to the PTA meeting. It doesn't
Okay,
work like that.
I agree. But
So we got to
what about the
fix
preachers
all
and
these
politicians?
problems.
What about our preachers, politicians, and
Uh,
potentates,
well,
business
all
people,
those
other
those people.
potentates?
Yeah, those people you just mentioned, in my opinion, are the beneficiaries of that $7.7 billion CPS budget. They don't really inherently want it changed. If so, that's a great question. You see in Chicago, you don't see one elected official or one pastor standing up for education. You hear them touting CPS programs because they get paid to do that, right? They get grant money to do it, but you don't see anybody saying, "Hey, this is not working for our community. We're watching it, but nobody is stepping up saying, so when you watch these marches, so now what we have in Chicago, you have this liberal left. The liberal left has stepped in, led by whites and Hispanics and their elected officials, and they talk about education. For funding purposes, they throw black and brown in the conversation, but it's only brown that benefits out of it. We saw coming out of our last strike, we saw Chicago Teachers Union fighting for brown students only. They fought for ESL. They fought for things that only affected brown communities, and you didn't hear one conversation about black. Let me do one thing before we go. That also, in my opinion, is part of this whole problem, right? CPS went from 80% black tenured teachers in 2000 down to like 4,000 or 5,000 now. So we've seen a complete upheaval. Those black tenured teachers that were around for a while, that Mayor Daley and Reverend Meeks convinced didn't teach our kids, those are the ones that kept our children in line, learning how to spell, learning how to talk and read and write. Now we have an influx of people who don't look like us, younger, that don't have a direct tie to our community. And I'm just going to believe they just really don't care. So the way to fix it, we need to go ahead and have a tremendous influx. I mean, look, they've been just like the police force. If you look at it, Mark, there's the exact same stories. If we talk about education, police, fire, construction, we still, at the end of the day, you have Chicago police and firefighters, which are 82% white and Hispanic. You have construction industry, 97% white and Hispanic. You have the teachers and the teachers union, 85% white and Hispanic, all in our communities, which means we don't have any black police officers, firemen, construction workers, teachers who are the middle class sustainable jobs and wages. So I think if we can somehow grab that back, we can see our communities uplift, and we can see people engage in institutions like community reform and education reform on a true level. But I don't think, other than a few of us, Mark, people don't talk about it like that. We just hear the sound bites and we keep on running with it. So we gotta broaden the conversation.
Brian Mullins, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
All right, thank you, sir. Anytime, Mark.